All right, we're live whenever you're ready.
Okay, very good. Welcome everybody to this January 11th meeting of the Post-Secondary Education Financing Working Group. Representative Jason Doucette here for our fourth meeting, which is being conducted entirely by Zoom. We tried the hybrid model and I think it worked pretty well, but unfortunately the public health situation did not cooperate with us returning to more live in-person meetings. Hopefully just a momentary pause on that. So we're back here on Zoom and happy to see everyone here. We have the agenda that was, I'm not sure if it was the last agenda that was sent around, but I know we probably posted an agenda a couple of days ago, and we had a late addition to that agenda with some guests who I'll introduce in a moment who were able to join us. But before we do that, I'd like to ask Jeanette Weldon if she wants to say hi and has any thoughts, remarks.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you for joining this meeting, and I certainly appreciate our invited guests coming to provide some additional information.
Great. And yes, without further ado, our special guests today are joining us from the Office of Higher Education. Our discussion at the last meeting, I think, raised quite a few questions that we thought that the Office of Higher Ed could help us out in trying to answer and provide some additional data and context for some of the things that we're talking about. And obviously, I think the folks there are an important piece of this discussion. And so I'm happy that they were able to join us today. So I think first I would like to introduce them and have them provide some remarks, and I don't know by way of a presentation what they may have prepared. But if you recall, I think the primary question I think we had was in the area of the discussion of state based grant aid to students, need and merit based. And historically, some of the changes that we've seen in Connecticut and where we might want to consider or recommend some changes based on the discussion that we've been having. And I think that our discussion last time was based off both the national trends and data and the reports that we reviewed, as well as some of the Connecticut specific conditions with regard to student debt and financing of higher education. So I see we have with us today, honored to have the Executive Director, Tim Larson, on the call, as well as Noelle Kidney, and I think I saw Mark French as well. So without any further ado, I would like to hand it off to Executive Director Tim Larson, if he's there.
Thank you, Representative. Happy to join in a discussion. We have with us today is our legislative liaison, Noelle Kidney, as well. Mark French, who is the director of the student financial services in our office. Mark is the consummate professional for the state of Connecticut. As you're aware, the Roberta Willis Scholarship Program represents somewhere in the neighborhood of $33 million, which is a program specific to Connecticut students going to Connecticut colleges. And then based on a formula that's been generated through legislation in amounts that have been generated through legislation, we effectively administer that program. And we have a need-based grant and we have a merit-based grant. And just for broad-based discussion purposes, I would suggest that the University of Connecticut would get, a third of those dollars. The state university system and community college system would get a third of those dollars. And then the independent colleges would get a third of those dollars. It just seems to work out in that regard. And although no individual necessarily gets the check, it goes to the school where that individual ultimately enrolls. So we've had a number of different conversations about amounts, limits, and so forth as to how this has been treated. Maybe Mark can just give us a quick history of the Roberta Willis, and then we certainly can talk to any recommendations you may or may not have. Our office serves a number of different functions, but primarily are a consumer protection office for students who are enrolled in Connecticut college programs to make sure that their interests are protected going forward, not only from necessarily a financial perspective, but from the coursework and the curriculum inside the independent colleges is really where we fall. So I would just maybe turn it over to Mark and let him give you a little bit of background.
Yes, hi, thank you, Tim. The state of Connecticut has, over the past 20 or so years, had sort of an evolution of financial aid programs. It didn't begin with, but in the evolution, the oldest programs were called KICS and CAPS. The KICS program was a separate grant program designed for the private colleges and universities in the state. The CAPS program was designed for the public colleges and universities in the state. And then there was a separate program called the Capital Scholarship Program, which was the need merit-based program. So originally there were 3 separate programs. Those then were combined into one program, if you will, under the Governor's Scholarship Program. And then that further morphed into what we now have, the Roberta Willis program. Give you an idea of funding levels. When I first started about 15 years ago, we were up around $60 million at a peak for funding for these programs. We're now at about $33 million. So there has been some significant changes there. All 3 programs, once they morphed together, were kept very similar as far as the function to the student. The award amounts changed, actually went up per student, which helped. The schools, what they experienced was sort of a combining of the KICS and CAPS dollars into one pool of money, which now is referred to as the Roberta Willis Need-Based Grant Program. And that program works where, based on prior year full-time equivalent Connecticut resident enrollment, the schools are given a proportion of the overall funding, about 20 some million dollars of the 33 million goes out to the schools. So if one school has more Connecticut enrollment than another, they'll get slightly more of the overall funding that's available. So each school gets a pot of money in the Roberta Willis need-based program. And then the school is responsible then for selecting Connecticut residents who meet the eligibility requirements for the Roberta Willis program. And basically those requirements are, they have to have an EFC equal to or lower than the annual cutoff limit. This past year, I believe it was 11,500, give or take. I'm off a little bit probably there. So anybody who had a federal expected family contribution of that or lower would have been eligible. Students are eligible if they attend full-time, 3/4 time, or half-time. The awards are prorated though, depending on their enrollment level. Students enrolled less than half-time are not eligible. The individual schools can determine the student award amount up to a maximum of $4,500 for the year. So no student in the need-based program can receive more than $4,500 per year, but the schools are free to award some amount less than that based on the school's determination of how much state money they wish to give those students. Then there's a third of the program of the 33 million that goes into what we call the Roberta Willis Need Merit Grant Program or Scholarship Program. And the Need Merit Scholarship Program does have a need component, which I always like to emphasize because the students still have to meet an EFC cutoff, regardless of what their academic performance out of high school is. Academic performance out of high school is either 1,200 on the SATs and or I believe now it's 25 on the ACTs and or being in the top 20th percentile of their high school class rank. Now this money is what we call a centralized program because the guidance counselors at the high school submit applications on behalf of the students who qualify based on the academics. OHE gets those applications and then we match up the FAFSA data, the free application for federal student aid that the students fill out with the federal government to see what their EFCs are. And if they meet the EFC cutoff, we'll make the student an offer of an award. The student then has the choice of school. So for this pot of roughly $10 million, the students need to tell us, I'll be attending UConn, I'll be attending Sacred Heart, I'll be attending Manchester Community College. And we then will send the money to the school that the student ultimately ends up attending. So that's a high-level brief overview of how the state primary aid programs work.
Okay, anything else, or do you want us to just go ahead and we can start getting into questions, Tim and Mark? Anything else you wanted to add at this time?
I would think questions would be best, Tim.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm having some problems with my video. So, by the way, I got a great face for radio anyway, so you're not missing much. So why don't we start with questions? I think we bantered around, some of the difficulties with this program, and keeping in mind you folks are the policymakers and so forth, that for a while there was a larger pool of money. So obviously with more money we can affect more individuals. If the rules change on how we develop the formula, in other words, just spitballing or throwing this out there, if you cut the grant in half, you'd give less money to more people. Again, another public policy decision. And then, Mark could get into some of the nuances of a little bit more control on the student's part, not necessarily the college or institution. And, all of that being said would have to be completely fleshed out, through a public hearing process and so forth. So I would just offer that. Again, we've had trouble getting freshman awards. So it's been difficult because of the pool of funds.
Yeah, so that maybe is a good place to start. And a first question, we've talked already in prior meetings and it's alluded to already today about the cut in funding for Roberta Willis Scholarship. Could either of you speak to actually when and how much the program has been cut, or what the funding levels have been?
Well, I defer to Mark
over the years.
The funding, I've been here for now will be 4 years. The level has been flat funded for at least the last 4 years. Mark may be able to speak a little deeper into the history.
Yes, the funding, as I had mentioned, when I started back in about 2007, I believe it was 2008-9, we hit our peak of just around $60 million for the 3 programs that exist. That then was subsequently within a year or two cut down quite dramatically. And those cuts were necessitated by the 2008 Great Recession. the cuts remained for quite a while. The state has been able to increase the funding a little bit up to where we're now at about 33 million, but we're still, what we're at about, 45% of the high that I saw.
Right.
And it was a difficult time because, of course, with the Great Recession, it was a time of greater need by the families. So it was a difficult adjustment, particularly for my colleagues at the school level who deal directly with the families and students. But we've been able to at least maintain a presence in providing state grant money to students who need it.
Yeah, but that is a pretty significant cut over the last, we're talking 14 years or so.
Jason?
Yes.
It's Julie Savino.
Yes.
I just, I thank you, Mark, for giving such a good overview of the programs. I just want to tell you, just from one institution alone, I can tell you where we have been through the cuts, where our high water marks were. And right, we were at our high water mark. We received almost $2.3 million back in 2009, 2010. That lasted for about 4 years. And during those periods of time, we were able to offer well over 600 students financial assistance at that time. And their average awards were around $3,500 for our students at Sacred Heart University. I mean, today, when we look at what we're able to provide our students, and it just, of course, this year we're in a flux. We lost some money again this year. As Mark has said, it fluctuates based on our number of Connecticut students in comparison to our colleague institutions. And just this past year, we received $386,000, and we're really only able to help 248 students. And our average award has dropped down to $2,400 for those students. So from an institution's perspective, you can see how over the years, we have not been able to help the same number of students in declining amounts of money in a time and when needs have been higher for our Connecticut students in terms of both their financials from their families as well as the cost of education. So, I mean, I think that's where our concern is, and Mark said that's right. Many of our colleagues, our institutions, there's been, institutions have always contributed well above the amounts of money. We're contributing in the multi-millions of dollars to our Connecticut students and have continued to increase that. And I think the unfortunate part is our students oftentimes, which someone alluded to earlier about our freshmen. I think Tim Larson mentioned, we're having trouble with our freshman students being able to be competitive enough where they're able to choose to attend. While they have access to lots of education, their choice of education is limited, again, within Connecticut, and often choose to go out of state. And I think we've been seeing this more and more and more over the last several years. So that's just, in a nutshell, from my institutional perspective, and I'm sure Mark could share others where other institutions have brought forward some concerns as well.
Yeah, perhaps this would be a good time for me to expound on this freshman conundrum we've been in for several years now. Under the old Capital Scholarship Program and under the Governor Scholarship Program, how that worked is pretty much all students who were eligible, who applied out of high school, received an award each year. There was enough money to fund them and fund the returning students who had received an award in a prior year as a freshman, who are now progressing to their sophomore, junior, senior year. Unfortunately, when the Roberta Willis program was designed, there was language written into statute which said that we could award no more than 30% of the overall Roberta Willis state appropriation to the need merit pool. So that comes to some figure just under $10 million based on the 33 million. what that did, unfortunately, was it forced our agency into a decision of we had about that amount each year in returning students who received the Need Merit Award. Therefore, we couldn't award freshman students, first-year students. So the decision was made back then when this all came about to keep awarding returning students, because it's my belief, and I think schools would agree also, it is more devastating to pull the rug out from underneath a student who's already established at college than to not award a student entering as a freshman. Their families, unfortunately, haven't budgeted yet and don't count on that scholarship money as a resource coming in for the next year. So that was the hard decision we were forced into. So what we do every year, we still take in thousands of applications from the high schools for freshmen. We send them a notice informing them that unfortunately, we won't be able to grant them an award for their freshman year. They are eligible, and being eligible their freshman year will make them eligible for their sophomore year. So then they begin getting the award in the sophomore year. And it really is an effect of the overall appropriation money times the 30% only leaves enough to award basically our returning students every year. And we've been under this for about 6 years or so now, I think. And it's not an ideal situation to be in. These students are going to Connecticut schools because we can't award these freshmen. These freshmen tend to be what we call the best and brightest, because they are the more academically gifted out of high school. That's why their counselors are submitting an application for this program. They also are needy because we do expect them to achieve a maximum EFC. We're leaving this pool vulnerable to be attracted by other schools, out-of-state schools, who are offering them scholarship money and maybe that extra $1,000 that we can't give them, and potentially they're going out of state. To lose some of the brighter students, to lose any student is hard, but to lose some of the brighter students out of high school is a little frustrating for the state, I think. The simple solution is to lift the 30% rule, but it is in statute, to allow us to award all of the eligible need merit students, and then take the remainder of the funds after that's done and divide that up for the need-based program. That would be the simplest solution to this.
Rep. Delnicki.
Oh, there we go. Mark, you spoke to the percentage division in the state statute. My first question is, what public act is that we're referring to exactly? Because I'd like to take a look at that.
It's 10A, and I don't have it in front of me. 10A, does anybody else have it? I apologize. I can get that for you.
Okay, if you would, and I'm sure other members of the
I
committee
want to
would.
say 179, but I may be off. Let me look that up quickly.
Okay. You spoke about the percentages, the 30% need merit and the 70% merit, correct?
Yes.
You also spoke to the concept of, or you alluded to the concept that there might be a better percentage outlay. And if that was you were alluding to that, what would you think it would be or should be?
Well, it wouldn't be a percentage. It would be first of we'll use the $33 million that we currently get as appropriation. Suppose between freshmen and returning students for the need merit, the eligible count came to $11 million in a given year. We would first award that $11 million to the need merit students. Then the remaining $22 million would be doled out to the schools based on the formula it's established to give out as need-based grant to each of the students that they select. So we would first award all of the need merit students and then provide funding for the students who didn't achieve the merit portion of the program.
Okay, maybe I misunderstood what you were alluding to, because it sounded like you'd made a comment concerning the fact that the percentages were like cast in stone. And
Well,
those will
they are. It is in statute. The 30% cap is written in statute under the Roberta B. Willis program.
right. And
So that would have to be changed.
I'm asking the question, if you could change that statute, how would you change it?
I would take out the 30% rule and allow for need merit students to be awarded. And then the remaining funds each year go out to the schools to be given out as need-based funds.
What other changes or improvements above and beyond the allocation of additional funding would you want to see in that statute?
I think sometimes we have it currently tied to the federal, what's called the federal methodology, the federal expected family contribution. I think sometimes tying too much of the minutia of the programs into a statute limits our ability to be flexible if we need to as things change. And we know this is something that is going to change. The federal government, the U.S. Department of Education, is going to change in the 23-24 academic year, 2023-24, from the expected family contribution. They've come up with a new determining factor on how much federal aid a student may be eligible for, called the Student Aid Index. So I agree we should always mirror what the federal government is doing, but putting it in statute is going to require in 23-24 a change to our statute, because we literally wrote into statute that we're going to use that index, as opposed to allowing the Office of Higher Education to determine the eligibility factor each year and not write it into statute. So this is something that will have to change. I've spoken with Noelle Kidney about this in our office as an upcoming change for next year, so that we're ready for 23-24.
And you'd have that prepared for the coming session.
Yes.
Good. Any other changes other than what you've talked about here and how the program is underfunded?
I'm a believer in incrementally changing things to get better than coming at everybody all at once. So I do have some other ideas. But I think that the most significant thing would be to secure the freshman awards again for the best and brightest. Look at fixing that issue first, and the EFC, which we have to fix because of what the feds are doing. And then maybe gradually looking at other things that might be able to be changed to improve the program for the students. Because my focus, as the schools are, is always what's best for the student. How does an aid program benefit them the most? And if I may, I'm getting the just about there with the act. I'm searching through our documents here.
Representative Delnicki, this is Tim. Understand that our role is to administer this program, and that we see some variances. And so all these are not Office of Higher Education, quote, recommendations. These are scenarios that need to be vetted in the full sort of public arena, if you will. So, we're not necessarily an advocacy group. We can point you in a direction based on what statistics we may have. And Mark is a consummate expert in this. Not only does he have years in administering this program, but he also has some private college experience as a finance person. And so, he's got a real good sense for the lay of the land and how this plays out, not only in the student benefit, but in the finance packages of families. So that's sort of what we're offering.
Yes, Representative Delnicki, it's 10A 173.
10A 173. And can I still refer to you as Senator Larson?
Just don't call me late for dinner.
I won't. I'm relying on some expert information from your team there. It sounds like they've got some good ideas, and I realize they're not an advocacy group, but it's kind of like the person that flies the airplane, and they know that there's a wobble in the wing, and if you tighten the bolts there, it might work a little bit better. Assuming it's a Pratt & Whitney engine.
Yes.
So I appreciate your staff, your folks there making commentary pertaining to tweaks that could make the system better. And I certainly appreciate that. Thank you, Chairman.
Julie,
Great, thank you. A couple of thoughts. I know, Mark, what you're saying, and we are all concerned about our students, best and brightest, and all Connecticut students that are seeking education outside our borders. It's been a concern now that we've had at all colleges and universities, I think across the state of Connecticut for several years now. But you know, I do have some concerns. We've actually studied quite closely the TICAS report. That's the Institute for College Access and Success in funding. And quite honestly, their proposals basically are saying that states shouldn't be pushing more towards merit, but should be looking towards need-based. And of course, in these times right now, we're also seeing, say, Connecticut now has dropped where there's 43 states that are much higher than us in awarding that. And of course, in awarding need-based aid to their students. So we've dropped so significantly amongst the states in the country. That's still a concern for us. But also, and it's been aligning, we can see that those states who offer more in need-based aid also have the lower loan debt for their students as well. The state of California is a good example of that. While they're a high cost and, you know, they're on the other side of the country, so it does present itself in that way. So I would ask that, you know, that kind of your recommendation, I know that allows that to go into the face of the students. Has there been any consideration of saying, well, why wouldn't we as a state then take all of that money? Because by the time you award those funds to those students and then give the allocations to the institutions, we're so late in the process. How would we then be able to serve our needy Connecticut students if we didn't know how much money we were going to get that late in the process? So I think that it has some concerns regarding timing. And, you know, I just like your thoughts as to why wouldn't it become some kind of, you know, for the students to apply. Again, it's all about the students and it's all about trying to get to needy Connecticut residents.
I think we can only speak to the current program. You know, what you're asking is a public policy decision that, you know, once we have the guidelines and the rails, we'll operate accordingly. We're simply giving you our experience. We are not necessarily advocating per se for any position, you know, one way or the other. You know, frankly, we have some experience. And, you know, it's up to the process to decide if statutory language could be changed, if total amount of grants could be changed, and what the total funding, you know, could be. That's the beauty of the legislative process.
Julie, if I can add also, just because this has been an ongoing point of confusion, I think, in the state with the way we name our state aid programs. All of the state dollars that are put forward in the Roberta B. Willis program are need-based. As a matter of fact, the need merit has a more stringent EFC cutoff requirement than the need based does. The need merit, the students have to have an EFC of 10,999 or lower. And with the need based, because the need based floats against the EFC from several years ago based on the formula, it's a little bit higher. So none of our money is given out purely on merit. So every student who receives $1 of Connecticut Roberta B. Willis funding is based on financial need.
Oh, I understand that. I wasn't suggesting that. Oh, I know that. We are completely all need-based aid. Yes, but it's a priority over, I mean, then you're putting such a strong priority only to the best and the brightest. My concern is that some of those other students that also need some of those opportunities really miss out on that. No, I understand that. I understand that. And I'm not suggesting that Connecticut should offer anything but need-based. But then, you know, in that calculation, giving merit such a strong, you know, a much stronger position in that, you know, it's just, I'm just wondering why that or that. And you're right, that perhaps maybe it's a way of relooking at the entire Public Act. If we're going to look to propose maybe one change, maybe it doesn't look to perhaps maybe look at the entire Public Act to be reevaluated.
Thanks, Julie. Krister?
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I just have a quick question. Well, one contextually to say that, you know, we've been talking about need-based and, you know, the reality of it is that tuition has gone up over the last, since 2009, we're at our peak at $60 million. Tuition has considerably gone up. UConn, for example, is attempting to go up, I think, 23% by 2024 is my understanding. So it's going to continue to go up while need-based from 60 million to 30 million. The question that I have is, at our lowest, what was the amount that we've gotten from the state in terms of funding for these programs? So we've had 60 million at our peak, 30 million we've rebound. How long has it been since we've rebounded to 30 million? And before that, what was the lowest we've had in terms of Connecticut investing in these programs?
Sure. If you can hold a minute, I'd be happy to get that information. Let me look that up for you.
No worries. Thank you. I know it's very specific.
If you want to continue on with another question, it will take me a couple of minutes to find this. I have it in here. I just have to.
No worries. Thank you.
Let's go for it.
Anything else, Krister, or should I go to Josh and we'll circle back? Okay.
Okay, you can circle back. Thank you.
Josh.
Yeah, thank you, Representative Gisa. I guess my question overall is, do we have information, graphs, charts, what it may be regarding the state higher education funding over the years? Because I guess maybe it's my ignorance, but I'm just not aware of how that state funding is broken down. And, you know, going back to Julie's point, you know, the data here I had seen from the independent colleges was of that state higher education funding, Connecticut's need-based aid was 3%. So I'm just trying to understand like where that other state higher education funding is going if such a small portion is that need-based aid. And are we able to compare that over the years?
I'm not sure the document that you're reading. That might be a different, I can provide you the last 4 years of where every dime of the scholarship money went. When you start to talk about the state's contribution to education, that's more of a full budgetary figure. You know, you'd have to compile that, if I'm understanding your question right.
I believe also the figures you may be looking at, Josh, I think I'm speculating, but I think they include the block grant funding that goes to the colleges.
It may, like I said, I'm just looking at, it was from a NASGAP annual survey. Again, I got this through the Connecticut Conference of Independent Colleges, their newsletter. And it went back to Julie's point where Connecticut, 43 other states in the US spend a greater percentage of state funding for higher education on need-based aid than Connecticut. So I was just trying to see if there was a way we could kind of piece that all together to see how the state higher education is funded and where all those dollars are going. And I mean, like, I understand that wouldn't just be like an OHE, it may be from multiple sources.
Yeah, so
Yeah, I mean, mhm.
go ahead, Mark.
No, I was just going to say, we certainly at OHE can put together, it depends on how far back you want to go. We can put together how much we receive in appropriations towards the state financial aid programs. But that's, depending on what you're looking at, there could be another piece that's other state contribution to higher education that our agency is not involved in.
Yeah, so understand that, as we know, the University of Connecticut is in its own realm, right? Their own board of directors. The state university system includes the 4 state universities, the 12 community colleges, and Charter Oak, separate division. The Office of Higher Education has the responsibilities solely for the licensing and accrediting of the independent colleges and the administration of what is $33 million in the Roberta Willis Scholarship Program, with a handful, I will say, of other smaller federal and state grants directly targeted to, we have a John R. Justice grant of $37,000, Mark? It goes out to individuals who want to become prosecutors and, paying for some of their tuition and so forth. So we have a very limited role our office has a very limited role in the procurement, distribution, allocation of that, what's represented in that document.
Understood. Thank you.
Tim or Mark, we'll go back to Krister's question about the funding levels. I don't know if you found that yet. I think
I
we were
apologize.
talking.
I'm working on it.
Okay. I think we were talking about 33 kind of being the low point though, right?
Yes.
And that's.
Well, I think it was actually a little lower than 33. And that's what I'm trying to find the low point here.
We could get you specific, but we typically use 33 because after the programs have been sorted out, it's typically a third across those disciplines, being UConn, the university system, community college, and then the independent.
Okay. So, I mean, I think we're setting up, the stage here for, I guess, if what we're talking about is a way to overhaul, reform that system to be able to award more grant-based aid to students and families of lower incomes. We're looking at, I guess, a few scenarios. One that was discussed was removing the cap, which would on the need merit, which would give us a little more flexibility to make those awards. But there are some downsides to that, I think, that have been discussed. Another scenario, of course, is to increase the overall aid, which I think we can probably agree would be the best option. And then within that option, we have the 2 scenarios maybe of whether or not we want to retain or to do away or somehow modify that cap. So, it's interesting. I think the point is well taken and should be emphasized while we're calling it need merit, that it's all need based. But I think there is something to be said for the fact that when you have that merit component and we have such limited amount of funds, are we are we providing as much opportunity to lower income students than that we could? I think Jeanette, if you have, I think that
Yes,
that kind of frames what we were talking about. But.
Yes, I agree, Representative, and I think it also goes back to Julie's point about, there are many needy students who may not fall into the best and brightest category. And I think the other thing that would suggest it could be updated to just be strictly a need program, not need/merit, is now many schools are no longer requiring standardized tests. So to have a merit piece that's geared to test scores may actually become more of a barrier for people just because now they're not taking the test.
That's a great point. Krister.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to add to what Jeanette said. Not only are they not taking some standardized testing, I think the other part of this conversation is that standardized testing tends to be biased against marginalized folks. We know from just general knowledge at this point, right, that standardized testing tends to have a negative impact on students of color, minoritized students. And so really taking into account how need-based sort of affects that. And I don't know the specifics, right? So I wouldn't know about that, but I do know that in general, standardized testing does have somewhat of an impact depending on the school you go to. And so that might, also be considered in this.
I do want to point out that the criteria for the need merit money is the student is eligible if they have the SAT or ACT score and or top 20th percentile in the high school rank. So that was already factored in that consideration that the national testing may not be the fairest. So if somebody's in the top 20th percentile, they'd be eligible also.
Thank you for.
I see Winston. Oh, Winston, you're still muted.
Thank you. Hand down, but still muted. All right. So thanks, folks, for this presentation. And I may have missed this as I was sort of feverishly taking notes, but I wonder if either Mark or Tim or someone could speak to, or maybe Julie actually could speak to what, if any, institutional eligibility requirements there are for these funds in terms of whether it's performance metrics, front end, back end, et cetera. And I think it's a complicated conversation to talk about school eligibility when we're also supporting the student. But I guess what I'm trying to get at is the ability to pay upfront for your school is only one factor in how you'll be able to navigate your finances during and after graduation. And so are there can the provision of state dollars to schools to support particularly low income students be used as a way to leverage minimum support systems, or maybe more than minimum support systems in school, to make sure that folks are exiting with their best foot forward and use that as a sort of state hook? But I guess I'm not familiar with what the existing criteria or eligibility requirements for institutions are for the program, if at all.
So we could lay out, our requirements and our parameters are set in statute. Truthfully, the discussion about cost of college education and so forth really lies with the university system itself, UConn, and the independent colleges looking at the total cost of colleges, because the colleges themselves set the rate, right? They're the ones who, define the tuition. They figure out what costs are. State of Connecticut comes in and helps fund the University of Connecticut, helps fund the state university system and community colleges and Charter Oak. So the questions you're asking are probably more defined and more easily answered by those individual institutions. Our $33 million has specific guidelines and parameters around it. And what Mark had mentioned in the beginning of the discussion was, what's a different way to slice the loaf, really? And then if you give us a bigger loaf, we can feed more people, but the parameters are pretty locked in. Mark, you want to comment?
No, I agree 100%. That's really where we come at this from, based on what is written into the statute. And, that's sort of what we administer is what's determined.
The backstop for the program is the limit on the family contribution, right? So, you want to be cognizant of state money. You want to make sure that the most needy and most eligible are being looked at first. It's not necessarily for everyone because, people with a higher expected family contribution cannot participate in this pool. Is that a fair statement, Mark?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, so if, this is not a program necessarily for a wealthy family that's trying to get their kid into a college program. This is really, we've tried to, keep the guidelines and the boundaries pretty tight so that we can maximize the funding for those more financially needy students.
Just real quick, I apologize. I finally found the numbers. The high that we were at, Krista, was 64 million back in 2008. And the low actually is the current amount that it's been at for the past several years, 33.3 million.
Thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Certainly.
I have to jump off to a 3:00 meeting. So if you have other questions, if you want to send it to the office in writing, we're glad to help out in any way that we can. All right. It was good talking to all of you. Thanks so much.
This has been
Thank you.
great. Thank you, Tim. Appreciate it. And Mark, appreciate your wealth of knowledge on this. Certainly given us a lot to think about and help frame the issue and some options that are out there. So
Yes, thank you very much.
I think that's it. Well, thank you for joining us once again.
Great. Thank you. Thank you all.
Okay. So I guess the next order of business is to talk about sort of our next steps in trying to wrap up what we've been doing here. Dawn sent out a very rough draft report. And I think, I'm not sure if it went out last night or this morning, but in any event, I know we all haven't had too much time to look at it, although there's not too much there. So I think it's just sort of a basic framework, kind of bare bones of what we've been doing and what we've been talking about. But most significantly, I think we have some proposed recommendations, again, as sort of a placeholder to allow us to discuss it a little more in depth. And I was hoping that we could kind of walk through that, and folks would be able to offer up some comments and thoughts on what's in there, what we missed, what we might want to include or tweak, or I think as this is currently a work in progress, the other thing I wanted to throw out there for discussion and propose was, maybe if we have some more work to include with this report, that it would be beneficial for us to convene once more and to have something that's a little more fleshed out and based on our discussion today. And then we can make any final recommendations or tweaks to that next draft of the report. That was the way I sort of saw this going. Jeanette, you have any thoughts on that generally and on the report and moving forward?
Yeah, I think that's a very sensible approach, and maybe in this meeting, to the extent there are some high level, points that people want to make about ways to, add to the report, And then do you think it would be helpful for smaller items for people to just submit those in writing as proposed changes?
Yeah,
And then it could
absolutely.
be incorporated into a second draft.
Yep, absolutely. So I'll put that out there. Yeah, anybody who has any specific conclusions or modifications, please email them to us through Dawn, certainly, and we will help to incorporate those. Just in terms of the basic, framework of this, as you'll see, I think what we've done here is we've kind of, in a way, the first few pages is sort of like the minutes of our meetings. We tried to summarize, starting with the very first meeting, where
Jason,
I think
would
there
you
were
like
some.
to call it up? Would you like me to put it on the page?
Sure. Well, no, actually, why don't we just? I want to kind of keep the discussion kind of free and not get too bogged down in some of the minutia of it just yet. Again, I think, I've sort of summarized some of the discussion of the meetings here, and certainly, again, as with any, board where you're kind of adopting minutes, that's not exactly what we're doing here, but I want to make sure all the points that were made are covered, or if anything is sort of mischaracterized, that folks are free to point that out and speak up on that. There's some data included in here. Certainly, it's not everything. This is just sort of a broad brush type of summary, high level summary of some of the data that we looked at. Not everything is in here. So if there are specific pieces of data that we missed or that we want to include, please let us know. But again, the biggest thing that I kind of want to discuss is the recommendations that we would make. And, I think we can be as detailed and as, enthusiastic or effusive about these recommendations, or as we want, or we can just sort of throw it out there as things that were discussed. And like any policy decisions, there are pros and cons to all of these approaches. So with the three recommendations, recommendation one, I think we've discussed a lot, including today, of course, which is increasing the amount of need-based state aid and grants, including most notably the Roberta Willis Scholarship Fund that we talked about today. Recommendation two, we talked about a little bit about last time, a state subsidized income-driven repayment program for student loans. Again, pros and cons with that. I think it is wonderful, of course, to be able to reduce the repayment burden for students. But there are some problems or issues with the federal income-driven based payment programs, so that we might not want to hitch our wagon too closely to that. Recommendation three that came up a few times is just financial literacy initiatives in general. To help students understand the implications and the level of debt that they're taking on, that's both an easier and harder thing to accomplish, of course. In that we can advocate for more financial literacy, but to the extent that we wanted to make a recommendation that it be required at some level, that's maybe a different story. So those are the three that were thrown out there, and I'd ask everyone here to A, comment on those, and B, if there's any other recommendations or things that we want to include as sort of high level recommendations that we are prepared to make. Tom, I see your hands up. You get to kick off.
Thank you, Chairman. So would you like us to make our suggestions in writing or broach them now verbally? Because I can do both.
Well, let's do both.
Okay.
While we're here, why don't we discuss and then,
Good.
we'll have some time to also send written suggestions, remarks.
Good deal. On recommendation one, I like the concept of increased funding, but I think we've also learned that there needs to be some more flexibility in how that language is written on that scholarship fund, because listening to the discussion there needs to be, from my view, there needs to be a little more flexibility in how they're doing it, and that in and of itself may be an adjunct to the increase in aid. Recommendation number two, I'm assuming that's basically copying more or less the New York State higher education program that we heard about from Zanny last time. And if we're going to make that recommendation, I think a little more background information pertaining to the cost, because on the outset, the first glance at it, it looked like a very expensive proposition, but historically in New York, dealing with a larger population, it's not that case. And that would be a good thing to flesh out. And in recommendation three, financial literacy is a big challenge. A lot of people don't have or have not received a good background in financial literacy. And it almost begs the question about what kind of a training program, educational program in the background to get people up on financial literacy that need that tool. And that is a huge tool for a lot of folks that don't have it. Just some thoughts.
Hey, Julie.
Unmute and take my hand down. Okay. I think these are great pieces, and I am concerned about the loan piece. And I just don't know, do we give more thought to developing a program here in Connecticut that can address the students of these alternative loans above and beyond the federal loans, which do their job, and most part, but those people, because I think some of the main concerns is that our alternative loans perhaps maybe don't reach as many students as they need to reach for those students who might need opportunities that don't otherwise have them. And I guess it brings me back to, sometimes the best and the brightest happen to have the most resources, needy or not, needy or, even those that are most needy. They get lots of scholarships, they have lots of opportunities, but sometimes it's those around the middle that we forget about, that really need the help and the support to move forward. And I just go back to the initial statement that was written in the Public Act 2162 that talks about the feasibility and implications of expanding access to its loan programs to student borrowers. And I think the repayment opportunities are there, but have we given sufficient thought to how we might open up access to another, loan vehicles for those that otherwise might be getting denied right now?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, and I think we just barely scratched the surface on the question of denials and sort of loan underwriting, for lack of a better term, in terms of how that all plays into affordability and I think in some ways it's a tough nut to crack, and that I wonder if that might be another point or recommendation, that we need more data still, and we need we need the ability of perhaps the regulators to be able to provide that data to get a better picture on what we're on what we're talking about there. Winston.
Great, thank you. That's actually a great, I have my little hand up, but a great segue into the point I wanted to make. So I think we do need to make sure we're keeping the sort of private student lending sector in mind for this group, and because of the legislative mandate, and just because it's a reality of, fact of life for a lot of people who are trying to pay for school. But also there are models out there for how Connecticut and how we can approach that issue. Data and access to data is a huge thing. I think we've talked about this before. I mean, Julie has shared out on several of our meetings various data sources, but no one of them, because it doesn't exist, is comprehensive and an accurate 100% snapshot for the state. And this is true for Connecticut and true for every state, except for certain states have started, in addition to licensing student loan servicers, which is a point, an aperture to see what's going on in the market, but at the other end of it, have started more closely regulating these private student loan lenders. And so about 3 or 4 states just this past year, California, Maine, Colorado, and Illinois, have started doing this front end, approaching the private student lending industry and not necessarily licensing them, but saying, you're doing business here, we'd like to know more about it, through a sort of a series of policy interventions. That is a relatively light touch regulatory move compared to full-on licensing. But to bring in Representative Dalnicki's point about financial education, one thing that Illinois did, which I think could be a model here, is that they passed a bill called the Know Before You Owe bill, which essentially made sure that at the point of taking out a private student loan, folks were given the right information at that moment in time, specifically their eligibility or any remaining eligibility for federal financial aid, right? Which typically have more consumer protections and are just regulated very differently. So there are models out there, I'll just sort of leave it at that if Connecticut wanted to better understand the private student loan industry operating in Connecticut, what's available to Connecticut students and borrowers and their families, while simultaneously providing information to them. And there's a sliding scale of regulatory options that the state can take, which has the sliding scale of costs to the state from very, very, very minimal to traditional regulatory costs, and a sliding scale of effect on the market itself from just information provision to complying with certain protections. So I think that's certainly an option to keep in mind, and something that I think we should think about in terms of how to move forward, how the legislature and General Assembly can be making decisions based on facts that are specific to Connecticut and to Connecticut borrowers.
Thanks, Winston. Jeanette.
Yeah, I guess, well, just a couple of things. First, I would say with regard to increasing regulation, I think, that can be helpful in terms of trying to ferret out or prevent, bad actors from not performing their responsibilities as they should. But in terms of increasing access and enhancing affordability of student lending, I do think that state support can be used in different ways. So what's in the recommendations right now is really speaking to how can we use state support to make paying on a loan more affordable. I think we could also look at how can we use state support to make it easier to get a loan. And so whether that means things like a pot of dollars that the state provides that is used to actually make loans, where the underwriting criteria can be relaxed a bit more, because I think, as I mentioned for Chesla, we fund our loans by issuing bonds in the public debt markets, which so obviously we have to pay debt service on those bonds. If there were a pot of money that the state were just providing that could be used to make, direct loans, that then where we could have more relaxed underwriting guidelines, and then actually even lower interest rates, because it's not tied to trying to repay debt service to bondholders. So I think that's another way that state support can be used. And I do also agree with Winston. There are some other models out there that other entities are using beyond the New York example. So I think we can take a look at some of those as well.
Okay, great. And to those points, both Jeanette and Winston, certainly, if there's any information that you want to share to be included or just kind of bullet pointed in terms of other practices, models, the Illinois law you referenced, Winston, things like that that we should reference. Please send those over. Again, just as sort of a bullet point for discussion comparison sake, but not anything that we necessarily have to endorse because we just don't have the time, obviously, to go through and I think talk about those things on the merits necessarily at this point. But all right, anybody else? Hi, Krister.
Thank you. I just have one. I just kind of wanted to repeat because I think I agree with what some folks are saying. I think having a holistic look at the problem, right, necessitates for me, or what I hear is access to those low interest loan vehicles underwritten by the state with support from financial money from the state, right, so that folks can have access to low interest rates should they need to have access to those, along with a commitment to getting back to perhaps those $60 million for the grants, right? So we were at 60, we went down to 33, and we seems like the last couple of years we haven't really increased that. So a commitment to being specific enough to say a commitment to at least getting to that 60 million that we were at, recognizing that student tuition has gone up. And I think the comprehensive collection of data for the state, I think it's really important so we can see the state at a glance. And I'm really intrigued about figuring out what are some ways we can, in terms of yes, the schools set up their rates and their tuition rates, but figure out ways that we can work with the schools to, when there's a huge increase happening, what are some ways that we can mitigate that or support that since they are getting some funding from us as well, right? What are the reasons that there's an increase, right? Really vetting through the processes of why are things increasing? What is the tuition cost, right? In that regard, but at least to me, definitely going back to that commitment of at least 60, because that's what we were at our peak. And so we should be getting more, not less. So at least being, saying that in the recommendations, right? So I think all of those things create at least a better infrastructure for student borrowers moving forward, both freshmen as well as returning students.
Great. Anybody else right now? Hey, Josh, go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, so just kind of piggyback on some of the prior points. I mean, I've hammered this home a couple times. Yeah, I think the need-based aid just needs to be increased. And that's kind of why I asked if there was a comparison over the years of how the state has funded higher education, because it was a percentage. So obviously the total amount changes, but it's a percentage of the total higher education budget. Additionally, from a financial literacy perspective, and I know this has been a challenge over the years, but from my view, it's, there's no real requirement for financial literacy to graduate high school. Yet at the same time, we're then asking these students and their families who may have no paying for college background to then make significant life decisions and financial decisions regarding higher education and their future. So, from my view, it's always been, I think financial literacy needs to be a requirement to graduate high school. I can think of plenty of classes I took in high school that are required that I don't use to this day. Yet financial literacy is key for higher education, but also just living as an adult in general. You need to understand your revenue and your expenses. And, I realize it's been difficult in legislative sessions over the years because these schools are short-staffed and also the funding to then have a financial literacy requirement. But I will continue to maintain that I think that that needs to be done in some way, shape, or form.
Thank you. Yeah, I agree with you, but I'll just share that my experience over the years has been with respect to this question. When you talk to teachers, superintendents, the response generally is yes, we agree, that sounds great, but we already have so many demands on what's required and what is part of our school day and part of our curriculum, that adding additional things can be easier said than done in terms of the demands on staff and the administration. So that is that I think is the biggest challenge to that, but doesn't mean that we shouldn't continue to push it forward. Okay, so I think I just jotted down here, we have the 3 recommendations that were in the draft report, which are the scholarship funds, number 1. Number 2, looking at an income-driven repayment program. Number 3, financial literacy in general. And then I jotted down 3 additional ones here. One was collection of data or having access to data, particularly on the private student loan market. Another one about a separate state-supported loan program. And I guess the question here doesn't have to be answered today, but would be sort of what would be the criteria, or what we know sort of who the borrowers that we're trying to reach here, but how would we classify it or define who would be eligible and the criteria for that. And then the last thing that Christopher mentioned and was something that I think we discussed over the last few meetings is drivers of the cost of higher education and how we could get a better handle on that. Anything else? Anything else? Okay, so I think this is good, and I think that's a pretty accurate reflection of what these discussions have been over the last couple of months. So again, what I was going to propose is that we get together one more time to look at what would basically be our final report and see if folks want to offer additional comments on that final report. And then we would basically adjourn the working group. You may recall the working group was supposed to convene a little earlier in 2021 and was supposed to report back what it said in the legislation by, I think, January 1st or December 3rd, January 1st, I think it was. So we were a little behind that schedule, but I think the ultimate goal, again, as a legislator, is that we be able to have the results or the recommendations of the working group before the next legislative session, which starts on February 9th. So I think if we keep to the time frame of trying to wrap up within the next couple of weeks, I think we're still in pretty good shape. So what I was going to propose was another Tuesday afternoon, not next week, but the following week, which would be the 20, someone help me out here, 25th? Yeah.
Yeah.
The 25th. And Jeanette, I know you said you a little later in the afternoon, maybe 3 o'clock instead of 2 works better for you on that day, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah.
So if anyone else has any major conflicts, that this is not set in stone yet, but let us know. But if not, what again we try to do is have folks email us with other things they'd like to see included, other tweaks or modifications to what we have in draft form right now. And then we would send around, what would be our last draft, and then have a meeting to discuss that. Does that sound like a plan for everybody?
Yes, and would we
Okay.
want to say, in terms of people submitting their comments or suggestions for the next draft, would we want to say, get those in by the end of this week, or sometime, would we want to say by Friday or by next Tuesday? What are your thoughts on that, Representative?
Yeah, how about next Tuesday? That gives us a full week to do that. So we'd ask people to, it's a good point, submit it by then, and then that would give us an additional about a week to pull it all together. And then I think we'd want to send out something by the end of next week, I think, to everyone.
Yes.
At the latest to look at. Okay, sounds good.
Agreed.
All
I
right,
will look for
everyone.
those emails.
Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. Happy New Year to everybody. And I appreciate everyone's participation. This has been great. And we will be in touch and see you in a couple weeks. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sounds
Take
good.
care,
Thank
everybody.
you. Bye-bye.
Have a great